400,000 people had worked for 8 years to make this moment happen. The greatest technological achievement in human history was 47,000 feet above the surface of the moon, and it was about to end in disaster. Neil Armstrong had 30 seconds of fuel left. Below him, a boulder field, rocks the size of cars, scattered across the only place humanity had ever tried to land on another world. He had no clear ground, no margin, and no time. And the abort option meant leaving forever. In the summer of 1969, the world stopped. Not just Americans or just scientists. Everyone. 600 million people, the largest television audience in human history, sat glued to their screens on July 20th, 1969, waiting for something that had never been done before. Not because they were told to care, but because deep in the human chest, in that ancient place where wonder still lives, they knew. The Apollo program had begun 8 years earlier with a speech and a dare. President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress in 1961 and said the United States would go to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
What he didn't say, what everyone in that room understood, was that the Soviets were winning. Yuri Gagarin had become the first human in space just weeks before. The space race was a war fought without weapons, but the stakes were just as real. Whoever reached the moon first would prove that their system, their ideology, their vision of humanity was superior. Kennedy's dare became NASA's religion. Engineers worked 7 days a week. Marriages fell apart. Men slept at their desks. And 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, died in a launchpad fire in 1967, burning alive inside their capsule during a routine test. NASA almost stopped. Instead, they rebuilt, redesigned, and 19 months after the fire, they launched Apollo 11. 3 men carried the weight of 2 superpowers, 600 million viewers, and 8 years of sacrifice on their shoulders. Neil Armstrong, commander, Korean War veteran, and a former test pilot. A man so composed, so internally quiet, that his colleagues sometimes wondered if he felt pressure at all. Yet, he did. Buzz Aldrin, lunar module pilot, MIT doctorate in orbital mechanics, aggressive, brilliant, and driven in a way that sometimes alarmed the people around him. He desperately wanted to be first on the moon, but NASA chose Armstrong instead. Aldrin never quite said he was fine with it. Michael Collins, command module pilot, the man history would remember as the one who stayed behind. While Armstrong and Aldrin descended to the surface, Collins would orbit the moon alone, farther from another human being than any person had ever been. In darkness, waiting, he later said he felt completely at peace. On July 16, 1969, at 9:32 in the morning, Apollo 11 launched from Kennedy Space Center. The journey to the moon took 4 days, and everything, every calculation, every test, every death, every dollar, came down to what happened next. July 20th, 1969. 102 hours and 45 minutes after launch, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed through the tunnel into the Eagle, the lunar module, and sealed the hatch behind them. Michael Collins watched them go. Then the Eagle separated from Columbia at 1744 UTC and began its powered descent toward the surface of the moon. In Houston, Gene Kranz, the flight director, ran his team through the checklist for the 100th time that week. Everything looked right. The Eagle was descending at the right angle. The engine was performing within parameters. The trajectory was clean. 47,000 feet, then 30,000, then 20. The moon's surface was growing, the craters were sharpening, the gray was becoming a landscape. And then at 7 minutes into the powered descent, at approximately 33,000 feet above the surface, an alarm went off. Program alarm 1202. Armstrong's voice was calm when he read it. Program alarm, it's a 1202. In Mission Control, 26-year-old guidance officer Jack Garman, who had spent weeks memorizing every possible alarm code, had exactly 2 seconds to make a call. A 1202 meant the onboard guidance computer was overloading. It was receiving more data than it could process, and it was dumping non-essential tasks to keep the critical ones running. In human terms, the brain of the spacecraft was about to have a breakdown. Flight controller Steve Bales looked to Garman. Garman had seen this in simulation. He knew if the alarm kept cycling but didn't lock up the computer entirely, the descent could continue. He had the answer, but saying it out loud with the world listening, with 2 men depending on it, that was something else entirely. He said, "Go." The descent continued. The 1202 alarm fired again, then again, each time. Go. Continue. Don't stop. 26,000 feet, then 15, then 10. The Eagle was dropping. The moon was rising to meet them. And then Neil Armstrong looked out the window and felt something cold move through his chest. The planned landing site, a flat, smooth area of the Sea of Tranquility, selected from months of orbital photography, was covered in rocks. Not pebbles, but boulders. Some as large as houses. The photographs had not shown this. The resolution hadn't been fine enough. And now, at 7,000 feet, there was no time to go back and recalculate. Armstrong made a decision. No announcement, no request for permission, no deliberation. He switched the autopilot to semi-manual mode, something that had never been done in a real lunar descent before, and took control of the Eagle himself. He began flying horizontally, skimming above the surface, searching for clear ground. Every second of horizontal flight burned fuel that had been calculated to the ounce for a direct, vertical landing. At Mission Control, the fuel gauges were ticking down in real time. Flight controller Charlie Duke, the capsule communicator, the voice of Mission Control, to the astronauts, watched the numbers fall. There were protocols, hard rules about fuel minimums. If the Eagle dropped below a certain threshold, Mission Control was required to call an abort. An abort meant firing the ascent stage engine and returning to orbit. It meant leaving the moon. It meant the mission, the 8 years, the 400,000 workers, the 3 men who burned on a launch pad, all of it unfinished. But Charlie Duke didn't call the abort, not yet. At 5,000 feet, Armstrong was still flying horizontally, still searching. The computer continued to throw 1202 alarms. The fuel was bleeding away with every passing second. Below the surface was relentless crater after crater, boulder after boulder, as if the moon itself was refusing to let them land. At 4,000 feet, Buzz Aldrin began calling out the numbers: altitude, fuel, descent rate, horizontal speed. He spoke steadily, not quickly, not slowly. The voice of a man trained to be the instrument even when the instruments are failing. And then, at 2,000 feet above the surface, Charlie Duke's voice came through the headset.
60 seconds.
60 seconds of fuel, not 60 seconds to touchdown. 60 seconds until the Eagle had burned so much propellant that landing was no longer possible. After 60 seconds, abort was mandatory. Armstrong didn't respond. He kept flying. Below him, still boulders, still craters, still nothing he could land on without killing them both. In Houston, Gene Kranz later said he felt something he had never felt in all his years of spaceflight: helplessness, because there was nothing more they could do. The decisions were Armstrong's now. The fuel was what it was. And somewhere out there, 140 miles above them in the dark, Michael Collins orbited and waited and hoped. At 1,200 feet, Armstrong saw it. A flat patch just beyond a large crater. Not perfect, and not what the mission planners had drawn on their maps, but flat, clear, and real. He steered toward it. He began his descent. Vertical now, engine angled to slow the fall. The altitude was dropping. 500 feet, 400, 300. The dust below them was beginning to kick up, illuminated by the engine exhaust into a strange, swirling halo. Armstrong could barely see the surface through it. He flew by instinct, by feel, by 8 years of preparation collapsing into a single, irreducible moment. 30 seconds. 200 feet. 100. 75. The dust swirled. The numbers dropped. the fuel bled away. Aldrin called the altitude mechanically, never stopping, never stumbling, a metronome, counting down to something that had never happened before in the history of the human species. At roughly 20 feet, with somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds of usable fuel remaining, a small blue light on the instrument panel came on. One of the contact probes on the Eagle's landing legs had touched the surface of the moon. Armstrong shut down the engine. The Eagle dropped the final few feet and landed. For 4 seconds, nobody spoke. And then...
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
After the mission, NASA went back through the data with extraordinary precision. When the Eagle's engine shut down at contact, the fuel remaining in the tanks, the actual usable propellant, was between 17 and 25 seconds worth of thrust. If Armstrong had not found that flat patch when he did, if the boulder field had extended another 100 meters, he would have been forced to abort. And an abort at that altitude, with that fuel level, was not guaranteed to succeed. The abort system had never been tested under those exact conditions. In the simulations, engineers estimated an abort from below 500 feet with critically low fuel had a survival probability they declined to publish publicly until years later. What would have happened? The optimistic scenario? The ascent engine fires, Armstrong and Aldrin reach orbit, rendezvous with Collins, return to Earth as the crew of the mission that almost made it. The other scenario, the one the engineers discussed in quiet rooms, was something else entirely. An abort engine failure, a guidance error, an insufficient burn. 2 men on the surface of the moon with no way up, and a world watching. President Nixon had a speech prepared for that outcome, written by his speechwriter William Safire on July 18th, 2 days before the landing. It was titled, simply, "In Event of Moon Disaster." It read, in part, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." President Nixon never had to read it, but it existed, it was real, and it tells you everything about how close this came to being a tragedy instead of a triumph. 6 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch, climbed down a 9-rung ladder, and stepped onto the surface of the moon. He said, he later insisted, he said, a man, that the static ate the article. The debate continues, but it doesn't matter. Because in that moment, grey dust on a boot, Earth hanging in the black sky above him, 600 million people watching, humanity became something it had never been before. A species that had left its world. Armstrong and Aldrin spent 2 hours and 31 minutes on the surface. They planted a flag. They collected 47.5 pounds of lunar rock. They spoke to President Nixon. They left behind a plaque that read, "We came in peace for all mankind." And then they came home. Here is what 30 seconds really means. Not the fuel, not the telemetry, and not the engineering margin. In 30 seconds, a 26-year-old guidance officer named Jack Garman made a call no one had ever made before and trusted that his preparation was enough. In 30 seconds, Neil Armstrong, a man so quiet and so disciplined that some people called him robotic, showed the world what a human being looks like when they are exactly where they were born to be. In 30 seconds, Buzz Aldrin read altitude and fuel figures in a steady voice while standing on the edge of a crater on another world. In 30 seconds, Gene Kranz stood still in a room full of brilliant, terrified men and chose not to panic. History remembers Apollo 11 as a triumph, and it was, but it was also a razor's edge. It was 17 seconds of fuel and a patch of flat ground that almost wasn't there. It was a president with a speech he prayed he'd never read. It was 400,000 people who gave a decade of their lives to a mission that nearly ended in a boulder field on the Sea of Tranquility. The footprints Armstrong and Aldrin left on the moon are still there. In the vacuum, with no wind, no weather, and no erosion, they will remain for millions of years. Long after every city on Earth has crumbled, long after the names of every president and general and king have been forgotten, two pairs of human footprints in the grey dust of another world. 30 seconds from never happening at all.